Really, the bottom line with all of those is you need to clearly define what the podcast is about. Hey, I'm Josh.
And I'm Laura.
And this is the Devising Good podcast, where we talk about how churches, small businesses, and nonprofits can use video to create understanding and provoke action.
So in the last episode, we talked about why people should start a podcast.
Yep.
And tonight we want to talk about what to think about before you start a podcast.
That's right. Yeah. So there are, there's several things that I think everybody needs to think through before they start a podcast. This is like the third podcast I've had my hands in. And so, yeah, it's when you don't have these things nailed down, it just feels a little bit aimless, and ultimately your viewer doesn't actually know what to expect. So
you need a direction, right?
Yes, you need a direction. And if you think about it, podcasts for churches, nonprofits, small businesses, they are different than most of the podcasts out there, because most of the podcasts out there are either news or entertainment based, or just 2 or 3 people just like talking, right, about whatever. But if you are a church, small business, nonprofit, I think your podcast is and should be different in that the podcast is all about giving value to your audience based off of how you serve them, if that makes sense. So you don't want to, for example, just real quick. So this podcast, right? It's about helping churches, small businesses, nonprofits create understanding and provoke action using video.
Right.
A lot of times that involves marketing. So if I start delving into things like, analytics and buying ads, ad buying, and all these different things, or because it's a video, like what if I started delving into filmmaking, because we're going to talk about storytelling principles at one point, but that's not what this is about.
So in a previous episode, you talked about how a nonprofit has, I think you said 3 different audiences.
Yeah.
So let's just think about that. When an organization, or when they have multiple audiences, can they have one podcast to hit all 3?
Good question.
Or do they need multiple podcasts?
I think you need multiple. So I think especially thinking about some of the nonprofits and things like that, a lot of times when you're a nonprofit, there are people that you're trying to help. There's the people, so there's the people you're trying to help, your donors, and then the people you want to volunteer. I think you could maybe do one podcast that's the like volunteer donor audience, and then maybe one that's the people you're trying to help, if you think that's helpful. Like if you run a homeless shelter, like podcast may not be your thing for the people you're trying to help. There's just different things that it's like, well, because of who my audience is, I'm not 100% sure that that's helpful. But to focus it, like when I used to work at Epifio, the video explainer company, we would always push to have one audience when we're talking, for one audience when we're making an explainer video, because it's like when you try to talk to everybody, you end up missing everyone. Sure. And so it's just way better to be focused, especially when you're like talking about a whole bunch of different kinds of things. You almost want a shared understanding of like, this is who it's for. So I think you should probably
So that makes sense then. You definitely need to know who you're talking to.
Yes.
Among all the people that you could even be talking to, who you're focusing on.
Yes.
And what are you trying to, almost what's the problem you're trying to solve with the podcast that you're starting.
Right. So you have to, and it sounds so dumb and simplistic, but you have to like keep in the forefront of your mind who you're talking to.
Right.
I, like, for example, I used to be in student ministry, right? And so one of the things we did was we had a podcast for parents, and the tagline was, we want to give parents tools to connect with their kids and point them to Jesus. If we started to say we started talking about something like summer camp or whatever, parents and students care about two different things when it comes to summer camp. So if we start talking about the things that students are excited about, unless it's like a way to give parents an inside scoop or something,
Right.
that's not my audience. So I shouldn't be talking about those things. I need to be focused on, what do the parents care about? And so it is very, like, it sounds like, who is this for? Know your audience. Well, yeah, but it's actually not that obvious, because sometimes you can just start talking or start making things that you're excited about,
Right.
versus what do my people care about? So
Yeah.
and then kind of like the next part is even just like, what do they need from you? So earlier I said that these kinds of podcasts are about giving value based off of who you serve and how you serve them. So this is the how you serve them piece. Okay. What do they need from you? What are the concept, like I have written here, what are the questions that you can answer? What are the concepts or conversations that they need to hear from you based off of what you do? Again, kind of going back to my illustration of, do I talk about filmmaking just because I know about video and storytelling? No. Do I talk about like ad buying just because there's marketing pieces? No, it's about video for marketers, for communication people. And so what are the questions and things around that? So I wrote down a couple examples.
Okay, awesome.
So for example, say you're a church. What are the ways that like your mission and values drives like your kids ministry versus your missions ministry versus like your groups ministry, or whatever it is that you do, or maybe the way and who you partner with different organizations. Tell those stories. Say you're a nonprofit, hypothetically like a crisis pregnancy center.
Sure.
Maybe your podcast could be a mix of testimonies of the people that you're helping, the women that you're helping, maybe even if you've been around long enough, maybe even some of the kids that have come out of it. Maybe you talk about, different laws and legislation that's coming up. Maybe you define certain terms just so people are aware of things that maybe they're ignorant of, or maybe they make snap judgments on that aren't correct. So that's an example. Maybe you're a small business and you say you help families stay safe on the internet. Maybe what you can do is you can review technology. You can kind of talk about what are the parental controls that should be changed. Maybe you talk about different terms and concepts. So like, as new things are coming up, how should parents be thinking about that? What are some of the things that they can be aware of? Not in like a fear-mongering way, but like
helpful.
Yeah, just to keep them up to date, or even ways that they can train their kids to use the internet. So the bottom line with all
of those podcasts now.
right. Like, and really the bottom line with all of those is you need to clearly define what the podcast is about. When people come to watch or listen to your podcast, they are going to get what? That's the thing you need to define, and kind of based on whatever that is, it's really helpful to come up with a clear, just sentence phrase of what it's about. Okay. So kind of like this podcast, we help churches, nonprofits, and small businesses create understanding and provoke action through video.
Okay.
The student ministry podcast, that was to help to give parents tools to connect with their kids and point them to Jesus. You know, there's just those phrases that are going to be helpful. Again, just to repeat every episode, so that way new people, when they stumble across your stuff, they're like, oh, that's what this is about.
Sure.
That's what I can expect. Or just to remind people, all right, here's what we're going to be talking about. It also is super helpful because it narrows and filters things for you. So I was thinking especially about the student ministry podcast. We didn't do a lot of things, and we also did a lot of other things because we're like, we have to give parents tools. Like, if they walk away from this podcast not with without a tool that is going to help connect them with their kid, help them point their kid to Jesus, then we didn't do it right. So that was just a very helpful, and it clarifies and it gives some grounding to the podcast and makes it more useful.
It sounds like it would help both the audience and the creator of the podcast, because as the creator, if you're constantly wondering, like, am I hitting on the right things or not? Like, it just gives you that clarity to, like, you clearly know if you are or not. So you don't have to live in vague, ambiguous land, which you just don't have time for. You don't want to do that.
Yes.
So
100%.
That sounds really helpful.
Yes. And then, at the end of all that, once you've kind of figured out, okay, so who am I talking to? What's this about? And kind of getting that phrase, then the next thing is kind of, what's your call to action? You know, a lot of podcasts, there's a way you want to engage with your audience. So sometimes there's the standard typical things of like, subscribe, hit the bell notification. There's the give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever. But a lot of times, especially, and we'll get into this more in the next episode where we talk about how to come up with topics.
Okay.
But, you know, if you're wanting input, if you're wanting people to give you feedback, give you questions, maybe one of the call to actions is, here's the way you submit your question. It could be like a text. It could be like on this podcast. If you hit the link in the description, it'll take you to a form on devisinggood.com. Like, that's the way we kind of handle that. But is there a specific call to action? Do you want people to share your podcast? Is there something you want them to download? Figure out what's the big picture, not per episode, but the big picture. In every episode, this call to action will be given. So that's one thing you'll need to do.
So basically, you need to know who it's for.
Yeah.
You need to know what problem you're solving, like how you're going about, like what the purpose of the podcast is. And then have a clear general call to action. Those are the 3 things.
And making sure that, you know, when you talk about the problem that you're solving or whatever it is, that you have that clear phrase that you're going to be repeating. And because in order to create the most value, you have to define what it's about. And it's really important not to miss that step, because the reason why this whole thing is important. It's really good to set expectations. That's all great. The podcast, for what I'm proposing, is a part of a bigger content marketing strategy.
Right.
So if you define these things, those shorter YouTube videos, those even shorter like YouTube shorts or reels, those are going to be more impactful. You are going to be able to have better content when you define what the big picture stuff is. So it's really important to not miss this step in planning, because it's a part of the whole engagement strategy.
Gotcha.
And if you do that, you're going to be setting yourself up way better to actually do what we always talk about here: create understanding and provoke action. Thanks so much for watching.
Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you can get notified when new episodes come out.
And if you have any questions, you can click the link in the description to submit your questions. And if we feel like we have anything helpful to say, we'll include it in a future episode.